I discovered my ex-wife's affair the day she was admitted into hospital. If ever there was a prize for the most horrible way to learn of your significant other's affair, I would probably win it and be in its Hall of Fame. Like so many people in this situation, I suddenly found myself as a member of a club that nobody ever wants to be part of. I will never forget the sound of my ex-sister-in-law's voice as she kept saying, I'm sorry, over and over on the phone while I drove home from a week-long business trip. I was confused and had absolutely no idea what she meant, but only after I managed to calm her down somewhat did she inform me that my wife was in hospital and that I needed to hurry home. My mind went into overdrive as I tried to get more information as well as not crash while I began speeding to get there faster. The only thing she told me is that it was an assault, then cut the call and wouldn't answer when I tried to call her again. My ex and I met in our mid-20s. It was through a mutual friend at a barbecue. At first, she seemed almost too good to be true. Not only was she incredibly beautiful, but she was also shy and introverted. It took a while for us to officially date, but once it happened, I was over the moon. When we first tried to get intimate, she suddenly started crying. Should have taken this as a bad sign. Fast forward another year and we'd gotten engaged. First-time intimacy also happened during this stage. I was fortunate enough to be able to buy a house for us courtesy of inheritance from my late uncle. Things were going great, and I half-seriously suggested we plant a peach tree, important for later on, to signify new beginnings, and she was all for it. Of course, we had our normal ups and downs like every married couple, but I considered us more lucky because she always made it a point to never go to bed upset with each other, and she would always point out gently if I did anything to upset her. Sometime later, life basically happened, and I was promoted at my job. It meant more pay, but it also meant I would be traveling more for work conferences and business meetings. I noticed she had been getting down a lot more and wasn't being as intimate as before. She would keep her phone close to her and even stopped gently addressing things that upset her. I tried to talk to her about it, but she assured me that she was fine, and this was a phase she was going through, and having no reason to not trust her, I let it go. She would sometimes go to her sister's place and spend the night telling me she just needed a bit of girl time with her sister. The day I got that fateful phone call was the day she was meant to be keeping her sister company again. I remember rushing into the hospital, barely breathing, and frantically asking about my wife when the world's most understanding and patient police officer sat me down to explain what happened. He told me he was a friend of my sister-in-law, and he happened to respond to a domestic disturbance call. He arrived on the scene to find a couple fighting. The supposed boyfriend was on top of the female punching her, and she was screaming trying to scratch him. This didn't make any sense to me because 1, this had nothing to do with my wife because we're married, and 2, literally everyone who knew my wife knew she wouldn't do that. He gave me a knowing look and placed his hand on my shoulder, then told me to be very calm because said girlfriend was actually my wife. If it weren't for the severity of the situation, I would have laughed in his face, but something in the way he said everything made me believe him. I then was ushered in by a nurse to see my wife, and what greeted me to this day, I still can hardly find the words to describe it. I just stood there for what seemed like an eternity. Then a doctor came in and explained her injuries to me. Her jaw was slightly fractured, her left eye was completely swollen shut and had massive bruising covering half of her face, as well as 3 broken ribs. Then the doctor dropped another bomb and told me she was pregnant. I still couldn't understand how this happened. Then I caught sight of her sister. She at first tried to avoid me, but at the persuasion of her police officer friend, she told her what she knew. It turns out my wife's ex had gotten in contact with her 5 months ago. He was doing this redemption pyramid step thing, where he would apologize to people he has wronged in order to clear his karma. Anyone else BS meter going crazy right now. They began talking more, then he convinced her to meet up for coffee and show her he was a changed man. Obviously, old feelings resurfaced, coupled with the fact that he appeared changed. Now it soon developed into an emotional affair. My wife approached her sister for advice, who told her to take things slow and just get it out of her system if she needed to, which then led to a physical affair 3 months later. She actually told my wife that she should at least make peace with her ex in whatever form it may be, and even offered to cover for my wife once in a while. My sister-in-law was in tears at this point and kept apologizing to me, saying that she didn't know about the abuse, as my wife never told anyone other than me and her therapist at the time about it. I was numb. I just couldn't feel anything and was absolutely dumbfounded by my wife's actions. When my wife finally woke up, I was there and she burst into tears upon seeing me. I spent the following months in zombie flight mode. There was individual counseling for her, as well as marriage counseling for us, at the strong urging of her family. In counseling, she was surprisingly forthcoming about how it happened and how she absolutely hated herself for causing me pain. She mentioned how at one point on her way home from his place, she actually fantasized about driving into the river because she smelt like him and didn't want his scent to corrupt me, however that made sense. She said she had tried to end it but was too weak, and only after learning that she was pregnant that it actually woke her up and made her realize that any further contact with this man was toxic to not only her but the unborn child as well. That is when she went to end things in person for good when he snapped on her. She became a shell of herself and developed a phobia for any other males but me. At one point, she couldn't even use the bathroom at night unless I was holding her hand. Sad, right? After the baby was born, son by the way, we got a paternity test and he was mine. But the more time I spent with her, the more I realized I didn't hate my wife. I actually loathed her. I couldn't see the woman I married, but instead saw his leftovers each time I looked at her. I decided to leave because I was afraid I'd do something I'd regret and be exactly like her abusive ex. She begged me not to leave and even made the ridiculous offer of giving me a hall pass, as well as slapping her if I wanted to. I knew at this point I had to get out. She was actually very generous during the divorce. She moved back into her parents and signed a very well thought out co-parenting plan issued by the courts. Chance, I was in a bookstore with a buddy of mine and we were discussing Egyptian mythology when this beautiful woman approached me to correct me on my pronunciations of the Egyptian gods and cities. Needless to say, immensely impressed by not only her understanding, but also by the fact that she is Egyptian herself. We exchanged numbers, which eventually lead us to dating. When I finally proposed to her, it was actually in front of the peach tree I had planted years ago. I got down on one knee, but before I got my answer, she ran into the house, then came out with a ring as well. Turns out she was actually planning on proposing herself because she was madly in love with me, and she just didn't want any other woman to have me. My son, in all his sweet childlike innocence, told his mother what happened because he was present when it happened. My ex literally showed up that night in the rain yelling about how could I propose to her, my fiancée, in front of our tree, and that this isn't the end of us. I'm completely exhausted at this point. I cannot go no contact because she is the mother of my child, but she is basically harassing me and my fiancé. How do I convince her to move on, to get over her fear of men, and not force me to get a restraining order? Sorry it was long, but I am really desperate. Thanks for listening to my story.